Comme je l'ai dit, j'ai le plaisir
As
d'accueillir
I
Jérôme Ducrot.
mentioned earlier on, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Jérôme Ducrot, pianist and composer, who's going to talk about atonality.
En
In 1863,
dans un roman qui
in a novel entitled Paris in the 20th Century, Jules Verne sketched a portrait of what he imagined music would be in 1960. Excerpt. At last, we shall play a little music, said Michel. Not modern music, said Jacques. It's too difficult. It's to understand is difficult, but to play it's not difficult. How? Well, I'll explain. Sit on the keyboard. What do you mean? Sit on the keyboard, I say. So Michel sat on the keyboard and produced a heart-rending harmony. Do you know what you're doing there? The pianist asked him. I have no idea. Well, you silly boy, you are playing modern harmony. Then the composer himself sat in front of the piano, and under his fingers, his hands, his elbows, the poor instrument produced impossible sounds. The notes jarred and struck like hailstones. No melody, no more rhythm. And you are counting on this piece, said Michel, asked Michel. Am I counting on it? Answered the composer. It is of my time. I will be understood. Could we have the image, please? Thank you. So this is not an adaptation of the scene I've just read for film. It's not fiction. This is the interpretation by Maurizio Pollini, a great pianist, of an undisputed masterpiece by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, one of the greatest geniuses of the 20th century, and dates from 1961 exactly, the year at which this scene written by Jules Verne is supposed to take place. In 1970, almost at the same period of this events of the text and of the piece composed by Stockhausen, the composer Steve Reich, who wrote some optimistic predictions about the future of music, wrote the following: "The pulsation and the requirement of a tonal center of attraction that is clearly defined will re-emerge as one of the fundamental sources of the new music." So let's look at what is the situation 40 years later with this rather short excerpt of the Concerto for Violin and Orchestra by Karol Beffa. I'm sorry to stop this here, such a fine concerto. Now, as to whether Jules Verne's prediction came to be, well, I think the first example we heard should suffice to convince us that it was the case. It has been the case, especially if I add that most of the music of that period was the result of this aesthetic approach. However, it may be a little bit early to claim that Steve Reich's prediction shall come to be, because even though we have magnificent examples such as the one we've just heard, the battle between those who wish to keep a tonal style of the 20th century and those who seek to free themselves from it is a battle that is far from being won. I believe that latter will prevail. But there's a risk. I will take the risk of conducting a comparative study of tonal, atonal language. There's been many studies for tonal music. There's been study of Baroque, classic style, the Romantic style, and for atonal music, the serial, post-serial, spectral, random styles. However, we have not any study of the common traits of all these subsets within the respective entities, tonal, atonal. So the trap of such a schematic analysis is that I will not refer much to the frontier between tonal and atonal, a frontier which is blurred, as are all frontiers between artistic genres, and which renders many composers of the early 20th century impossible to classify according to this terminology. However, the porosity of this frontier does not exclude the reality of a deep difference between the entities that are on each side of this divide, and this is what particularly interests me today. Such a binary comparison makes it possible to explain, in part, the divorce between the music-loving audiences and contemporary music of the 20th century. A divorce, if there was need of proof of this, there is the fact that in international competitions, in contemporary pieces are imposed just simply to ensure that students should play them. So we should point out that it was never necessary to impose romantic music in the 19th century or classic music in the 18th century. On the contrary, contrary to all claims of art history, music of the time has always been favoured by the people at the time, except for 20th century music. Why this divorce? Well, I was simply trying to explain that we can no longer attribute this to the fear of novelty. First of all, we'll see that contemporary music has not offered anything profoundly new during several decades. And music lovers who dislike contemporary music do buy the latest film or the latest novel. So they have no inherent fear of novelty. If the reasons of the passage to atonality at the beginning of the 20th century have been analyzed in depth, however, the return to tonality in the wider sense of the term in the recent years has not been profoundly analyzed. This is commented superficially by those who wish that the 20th century musical style should remain for what it is for centuries to come, and accuse those who think differently of being revisionists, reactionaries, or such as Karl Beffa, who seek to break free from the dogma of atonality. These attacks, which are given a political tone, are aimed at masking the real reasons for this neotonal tidal wave, whereas these reasons are in themselves very interesting to analyze. There is no desire, and Karl will not contradict me, among the neotonal composers of coming back to the ancient order on principle, simply because it is older. No, I believe the profound reasons for the situation are to be found in the Aporias of atonality itself and in the non-negotiable principles which are the origins of its advent, principles that need to be challenged to enable music to evolve. a music which must return, something which is only apparently paradoxical, but which requires a return to the essential functions of tonal language. Barthes, here in the Collège de France, in his last lecture, referred to the need for filiation in the creation of a work of art, quoted this sentence by Verdi: "Let us turn towards the past, it will be a step forward." Although the notion of progress should be pushed aside or dissociated from the artistic element, however, I believe that by looking to the past or to move forward backwards, to use Sartre's comment about Baudelaire, is something which is relevant, and I think it's the best thing we can do today. And since we're going to talk about musical languages and and I have a piano available, I'm going to give you a few examples. And to start with, I must give honor where honor is due, so we'll start with tonal music. Let's not pretend otherwise. There was a little problem at the end. They're called wrong notes. There were two. Okay, well, fair enough. I admit it. And all the more so, I admit it, because I did it on purpose. These wrong notes will be the red thread of my lecture today. In fact, what is more important is the fact that you notice these wrong notes. So without having studied the laws of tonal language, you were able to hear two wrong notes in a piece that has more than 100 notes, a piece of music that you could not know because I composed this piece for this lecture. Now, something else completely different, something which I hope will be properly performed, an atonal work. It's particularly interesting because it is the first work that was composed in a theoretized atonal language. It is the first serial dodecaphonic piece composed by Schubert in 1923. And I will play the first page. Okay, well, that was better. Well, I have to admit that everything went well at the beginning. The 7 first bars were performed practically perfectly. And then on bar 8, maybe because I'm of stage fright, my left hand went down a half tone, and for all the subsequent bars, something that I sought to correct in bar 15 but I made a mistake. I didn't increase by a half tone my left hand, but my right hand. So my left hand, my right hand were out of sync. So I managed on bar 20 to bring my right hand down a half tone, but this had the impact on the following bar, bringing my left hand down a half tone. If you followed correctly, it should have risen by a half tone. And miraculously, in the middle of bar 25, my two hands, and I was able to play brilliantly bars 26 and 27 as they were meant to be. So the beginning and the end were played properly, and in the middle I played any old thing. I counted the number, in the example, the number of wrong notes. There are 79 wrong notes. Not one was perceived by the specialists present today. So, in other words, if we were to sum up the situation, non-specialists identify 2 wrong notes in a tonal piece that they are not meant to have heard before, whereas specialists cannot identify 79 wrong notes in a 31-second excerpt of an atonal piece that dates back 100 years and part of the repertoire. This, I believe, as an example, is edifying and gives us one of the major differences, exposes one of the major differences between tonal and atonal music, and enabled me to analyze this difference. Another experience of the same type, but simply to show to you that the other atonal styles present the same characteristics, because one could compare or contrast the serialism with free atonal music. I'm talking about atonality more generally. So I'll play 2 examples. Now, obviously, you're not going to trust me anymore because I put wrong notes all over the place. So what I'm going to do is approach it from a different angle. I'm going to take 2 short excerpts from 2 different composers, atonal style, more recent composers, and with each excerpt I'll give you 2 versions and explain them. One will be the true version, and the other one will be totally disfigured. So it's up to you to identify which piece is the right piece. Maybe with the help of Carole, we'll manage to do this. So we start with Donatoni. Donatoni. That was the first version. Second version. Any idea? No idea? Even the specialists? Okay. We'll take another composer, Courtag, then we'll stop afterwards. Same thing. A good version, a bad version. Second version.
No?
No, nobody? Well, what about that? All right, we'll try a last one, just to make sure that it's impossible to do, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. 2 versions. Second version. Now, should I insult your intelligence further? No. Okay, so the disfigurements were exactly the same in the 3 examples. Basically, shifted one of the hands by a half tone and then added a few strange notes. It would seem that the ability to discriminate is present when we have tonal music and disappears when it is no longer tonal. I would like to insist on the fact that you've recognized the right version of a work by Beethoven. It has nothing to do with the fact that you may know this work. It would have had exactly the same, been exactly the same with, for instance, a piece as I did in the first example. And it has nothing to do with getting used to a piece of music. The wrong notes were perceived from the beginning, because no one would have noted the peculiarities that may have been blamed to such and such a composer, which really were exactly that. the intended wrong note. That's what I want to say. The composers have a language in tonal music, rules that the public is well aware of. They don't even have to announce. And the whole discursive work of the composer is based on your knowledge of these rules. It is the characteristic of a language and could be part of its definition that it is a coded system of which the protagonists, those who emit and those who receive the message, share the principal elements. In French, for instance, and since it is the language that we are using today, there are many examples of rules that we comply with. We may have forgot them or never learned them formally. If a foreigner asked us, in what tense should we conjugate the verb following il faut que, we will all proceed in the same way. We will formulate one or several sentences that start with il faut que, I must, il faut que je vienne, il faut qu'il prenne, and then from that we will deduce that il faut que will be followed by the subjunctive form. Now, with a rule, for instance, that we don't know, let's imagine the following clause. Un savant aveugle. There are two ways of reading this clause. You can read un savant aveugle, or you can read un savant aveugle with a liaison. If you listen carefully, you have a difference in meaning between the two ways of reading. And when I say un savant aveugle, one understands a blind scholar. If I say a savant aveugle with a liaison, you understand a scholarly blind man. Without the liaison, aveugle is the adjective. With the liaison, savant is the adjective. So there exists a rule which you can find, for example, in the Grévis grammar book, which goes as follows. One does not pronounce the liaison after the final consonant of a singular noun. And there are examples. Once you know this, for example, we will say un loup affamé, un collier admirable, un sujet intéressant. No one would say c'est un sujet intéressant. Très intéressant. We say c'est un sujet intéressant, no liaison, because sujet is a noun. Très intéressant, a liaison between très and intéressant, because très is not a noun. So it's a striking example of a rule that we employ every day, and no doubt it's a rule that no one has heard about. These rules in music, as in the French language, these are rules we've assimilated simply by the repetition of correct usage we have been exposed to. So if you hear repeatedly sentences well composed, you know what the rule is. So upon the advent of atonality, it was believed, perhaps in good faith, that the repeated correct usage would ensure all listeners assimilated the language. However, this has not been the case. A composer, an eminent composer, who composed serial music for many years, said to me when I had played on the piano an orchestral reduction of the concerto to the memory of an angel by Ellenberg, this serial piece, he said, has in the score many errors of natural F instead of F sharp, and that all the performances were performed with these mistakes. So I said, where are the wrong notes so that I can correct my score? And the composer said, I do not know. I can't tell you because my corrected score is at home. So what does this say? What does this mean? In tonal music, there is an empirical knowledge of music that allows us to know whether the phrase is correct. In atonal music, on the contrary, being deprived of the sensation that the note is right or wrong, we will therefore have to deduce this from the rule. In tonal, as in spoken language, we can deduce the rule from the phrase. In atonal, for instance, serial music, you have to deduce the phrase based on the rule. So now it is time for us to focus on this knowledge you have of language that can be defined at least as your ability to predict, to pre-hear what should be the music that will follow in the next second. I will take my example at the beginning that surprised you. Okay, I agree. That's the wrong...
quand vous entendez ça,
what happens when you hear
que vous
this?
soyez spécialiste
Whether you're a specialist or not,
ou pas, ou que vous simplement vous
or
aimez,
whether you know how to compose or not, or simply just because you like music, you know
nous avons tous la même réponse.
we all have the same answer to this question.
Le compositeur,
The composer,
que vous le savez,
who knows that you know this, may decide to surprise you.
c'est pas mal aussi.
That's not bad
Ça n'est pas
as well.
forcément ce que vous avez
It's
fait.
not necessarily what you expected. We call it breaking a cadence.
Ça fait partie du
But you can consider this as part of the realm of possibles. But if I do,
Tout le monde est sûr
everybody
que c'est pas partie du champ des
is convinced that it's not part of the realm of possibles.
encore moins.
This even less.
Essayons avec de la musique.
Let's try with atonal music, contemporary.
On a envie de quoi là après?
What would you like to hear now?
Bon, je recommence.
Okay, I'll start again.
Ah, c'est pas mal.
Not bad. Yeah.
Mais aussi. Possible.
That's possible.
Crédible.
Credible.
J'arrête parce qu'on peut.
I'll stop because we could spend the whole day or all night doing this. Everything is possible.
On s'attend à tout.
We expect anything, and since we're expecting anything,
Surpris par rien.
we are surprised by nothing.
Nous entrons donc dans une
And
phase.
therefore, we begin to listen passively.
On se dit,
And we simply say,
tiens, il a fait ça.
oh, he did that.
Si on analysait un peu vite
Now, if we were to
jusqu'à
analyze
présent, on pourrait donc
too
conclure qu'il y a
hastily, we
dans
might
la musique tonale un
conclude
type
that
d'accord
there'll
qu'on
be
admet
a kind of consonant chord in tonal music as admissible and one that's dissonant that is not admissible. So this capacity to discriminate that we have when listening to tonal music would be the expression of recognition of the absolute value we attribute to sounds.
déjà pas mal et ce serait déjà
That would be proof that everyone has a pretty good ear. However, we will see that reality is slightly more complex
votre compréhension
and that your understanding is much deeper. So I need to conduct an improvisation. Etc. Did you like that?
Eh ben, j'en suis ravi.
Well, I am delighted, not so much because it flatters my ego as an improviser, but simply because I played 4 times this chord and you didn't hear it.
Je remonte
So I'll show you again.
dès le début. J'ai fait
From the
ça.
beginning, I did this.
Il est là.
It's here.
Arrêt sur image. C'est le même.
It's the same one.
Ici, ça va très bien.
It sounds great here.
J'ai fait ça après.
And I did this afterwards.
Voilà. C'est quoi? C'est celui-là.
It's that one. Horrible here. But here,
Formidable.
fantastic.
Après, j'ai fait ça. Même chose.
Same thing.
Le même, encore une fois.
Again, the same one.
Voilà qui devient
So this
extrêmement
is
intéressant.
extremely interesting.
Parce que ce ne sont donc pas
Because they're not just certain sounds that displease you and other sounds that are okay. There's certain sounds you admit in certain contexts and refuse in other contexts. And this changes the dimension of your knowledge because
la notion du
this brings in the notion of meaning.
Vous refusez
And sounds are like words. You refuse a note in certain phrase, not because you don't like the note, but simply because you believe it's inconsistent in this phrase. It is not part of the realm of possibles that I was talking on
ma fausse
earlier
note
on.
de départ.
So my wrong note at the beginning, it's as if I had said to you, for a long time, I went to bed at an early goat. you know immediately that the last word is wrong, that it is a wrong note, to continue the metaphor. But it's not because it's a neologism or because it's something rude that I said. It's simply because it goes against the meaning of the sentence, whereas it would be perfectly relevant and appropriate in another context, like our chord. Literature, since we're talking about literature, has also been through a modernistic deconstruction of language in which subject, verb, complement, all all these things are things of the past. We must change all that. And we've forgotten that literature has or had gone through the same sort of process. So I have unearthed a little excerpt to continue this parallel between music and language. I'm going to read to you a short excerpt from a piece written by Tristan Tzara, dating from 1916. It's one of the first Dadaist writings. Closed doors without fraternity, we are bitter, fell, wir render scolapander of the Eiffel Tower, immense paunch and pensive paunch thinks, mechanism without pain, 1798, 58, 555, EAOB bo fi fi ha ha, my God, oh my God, along the canal, the purpural fever, scarab and SO2H4, matopo tomb, and the viceroys of the night. They lost their arms, the irregular polygon. At Matsakas, the ladybird is longer than the cerebral hemisphere. And where are the viceroys of the night? Well, obviously, when you hear this, you become completely passive, as one does when listening to atonal music, because you're not expecting anything. There's no meaning. I can make as many false notes. You will not hear them when I read. And I did so, as you have no doubt guessed. I replaced lace by scarab in the text I've just read, which I believe in a text which would have meaning would pose a problem. But here it posed absolutely no problem. In other words, tonal Proust, if I replace early by goat, everyone hears it. If I replace atonal Tzara, replace lace by scarab, nobody hears it. So in the same way, I was able to disfigure Schönberg, Donatoni, Courtag, without anyone noticing, whereas two wrong notes in tonal language was jarring to your ears. So we have to admit that we can only disfigure with impunity something that has no meaning for the spectator or listener. So the tonal composer has a language which enables him to work with the power of prediction of the listener. It is at the basis of art music because it is what has led to developing a language and a musical discourse. Claude Lévi-Strauss, who identified the essential properties of tonal language that serialism, according to him, is incapable of producing, described it in the following way. The musical emotion stems precisely from the fact that at each instant the composer adds or subtracts more or less of what the listener predicts on the basis of a project he believes he can predict. He adds, the aesthetic enjoyment is made up of a multitude of emotions and respites, foiled expectations and expectations fulfilled beyond what was hoped for, the results of the challenges presented by the work. So I'm going to use the piano again to give you 3 examples among thousands of examples. This ability that the tonal composer has of using our knowledge so as to surprise or to flatter our knowledge. Now, in the case of Bach in Cantata number 54, a melody, the singer sings, Lass dich nicht den Satan blenden, denn die Gottes erschrenden trifft ein Fluch, der tödlich ist. Do not let Satan blind you, since profaning the glory of God brings about a deadly curse. Well, one, of course, needs a lot of imagination and talent to paraphrase such strong, powerful lyrics, and Bach succeeds brilliantly, and he uses your predictive capacity to do so. The singer sings twice this phrase, and the second time, at the time when he sings brings about a deadly curse, Bach introduces a perfectly normal cadence. And we expect this, of course. That's what you expect. And Bach will write, using here a chord, which is perfectly normal, but rather surprising at the time of a cadence, because instead of giving us the impression we're arriving somewhere, it gives us the impression that the music is going to start off again, as though something had been skipped. This chord will lead to a ritornello from the orchestra, at the end of which the singer will sing the same phrase again, at the end of the phrase the second time, on the words brings about a deadly curse. Bach, once again, introduces a classic cadence. At which we expect this, or maybe what we expected the first time, but here would have no meaning because it's the last time that the singer sings it. But in fact, instead of this consonant chord that he has available to him, and which is the one we expect, Bach is going to use the most dissonant chord he has, which is called a tritone, because it is based on this interval, which is slightly unpleasant to the ear. It's an augmented fourth, and at the time was considered as the devil's interval in music, and therefore perfectly relevant to the lyrics. So I will try to sing this.
Lass dich nicht den Satan blenden, denn die Gottesehre schänden, trifft ein Fluch, der tödlich ist. Ritournelle de l'orchestre.
Ritornello.
Cadence normale.
Normal cadence.
À l'issue de laquelle le chanteur reprend. Lass dich nicht den Satan blenden, denn die Gottesehre schänden, trifft ein Fluch, der tödlich ist. Effet dramatique.
So the dramatic impact. It's not what you were expecting, but it is extremely surprising. Another use made of predictive capacity, in this case with Schubert, in an impromptu that starts sort of soft, smiling nostalgia that the composer is so fond of. In the middle of this, he introduces a more dramatic moment. That he's going to want to come out of by changing the lighting, by maybe not using the original tones, but to use something more luminous to come out of this dark music. How is he going to do this? I'll play and then I'll explain later. So the passage is going to arrive. The drama. What happens here? I don't know if it gave you the same shudder of enjoyment. What happens when Schubert does this? What happens? Well, we use the fact that you were expecting something else. So Schubert is not only does he know that you're expecting a normal resolution, which would be that one, but he's going to give it to you, what's more, twice beforehand in the passage. And when we come to the third time, that's when he changes completely. At the most unexpected moment, he changes completely a degree, and he surprises us with this way of resolving the cadence. First occurrence. Then again. Second occurrence.
il a changé un tout petit élément.
This change is just a small melodic element to justify the repetition. First time we had.
Deuxième fois.
Second time we had.
Et troisième fois.
Now the third time.
Autrement dit.
In other words, if we come back to what Lévi-Strauss said, expectation,
Et attente trompée.
Misled expectation.
Et récompensée.
And then rewarded beyond expectation.
Rappelons que pour que
so that we should be surprised, we need to have expected something else.
Et que c'est le même
and it is the same mechanism
qui se déclenche en vous
that you experience when you shudder at the horror of the wrong note at the beginning, or you tremble with pleasure with this modulation. This mechanism is, I'd say, the immediate ruling over an anomaly. There are only a few milliseconds between the committing of the offense, the investigation, the defense, the summing up of the prosecution, and the verdict. In the first case, the verdict would be the musician is bad. In the second case, the composer is brilliant. But these two verdicts will be the outcome of the same sort of trial, and the trial by the listener of the unexpected note. So just a few words to talk about special use of your predictive ability. It's the harmonic progression. It's a sort of logical sequence which is intended to flatter your prior knowledge of the discourse and is hence very much appreciated by music lovers. When it arrives, you can predict not just one note beforehand, but 2, 4, 6, even 8 bars beforehand. And you can not only predict the harmonic sequence, but also the melodic sequence if the composer has introduced a few elements of melody. So, when the march arrives, you have the impression that you know this piece, even though you've never heard it before. And even better, you get the impression that you composed it or are composing it. It is a gift the composer gives his audience. And very often the march is used after a passage when your attention has been taxed or your nerves slightly strained. I'm thinking, for instance, of the passage of the second Klavierstück by Schubert. An arid landscape. The tension is palpable. And it rises. And when it reaches its zenith, Schubert says, march. So here we feel that we have a whirlwind of contradictory feelings that invades us when it comes. It's difficult to describe, but I'd say we can say that we feel deep gratitude towards the composer who has decided to say to us in this manner, because that's what he's saying, thank you for your attention. Mozart, in the same way in his 23rd concerto, after a passage where we find ourselves a little lost, a slightly rather hesitant passage, we'll play this on the piano, it's between the orchestra and the piano, and it changes every 2 bars. Where are we? And then Mozart says, well, look where you are. Ah, yes, I know this. So this comfort to the ear brought by the march made it very popular among composers who compose popular tunes. And it's exactly the same principle as with Mozart. You can superimpose it.
ressemble, toi qui m'aimais, et je t'aimais. Celle de Schubert.
And Schubert piece can be treated in the same disrespectful manner. Why do these superimpositions that are rather provocative? Why should I do them? Well, no, I'm not seeking here to indulge in a relativist approach that says that would claim that the umbrellas of Cherbourg and the impromptus of Schubert are the same thing, or autumn leaves and Mozart, the concertos are the same thing. No, it's just to say something that's very important, that's often forgotten. In the tonal world, before atonal schism arrived, art, music, and popular music used the same language. In 1934, in relation to this, Schoenberg had an insight of searing intensity, the full measure of which has not yet been acknowledged. He says, there will always be tonal music because there will always be a need for popular music. Now, it's incredible to hear such a thing said. It's incredible to think that a composer who developed a language which he feels will not be that of popular music should do so. It is unfortunate, in a certain manner, that he didn't go further, because he had done the hardest by recognizing before that popular music would never be atonal. He could have gone further in his reasoning to realize that atonal music would never be popular. The different possible states of language are sign that is language. Tristan and Isolde and Viens Poupoule, a popular French song, are written the same language, composed the same. Julien Grec, the writer, and Fernand Reynaud, the stand-up comic, use the same language. Marguerite Yourcenar, the novelist and essayist, uses the same language as Denise Fabre, the TV presenter. So a language with a single mode of expression would just simply be jargon, or worse, a glossolalia, and wouldn't lead to the creation of masterpieces. One of the collateral casualties of abandoning an intelligible language is that by depriving itself from the possibility of surprising its audience by anything other than gestures, atonal music has also deprived itself of being able to evolve profoundly. Since Verlaine or Varese, who offered incredible and literally unheard of works to their audiences, the atonal style, which it has offered nothing else of any surprise for about a century, because the devices or strokes of genius that the composers of the tonal era used to seduce or to surprise their listeners led them to discovering unexplored musical dimensions, some of which were abandoned, others which became movements. These dialectics, once they were abandoned, it was unavoidable as a result that music would not evolve in depth, only make parameters that are used evolved. Hence, because for many years we've focused so much on music evolving, and it has evolved so little. Pierre Boulez himself said something that was very true. He said, we pretend that the 20th century has evolved a lot. It is wrong. There are fewer differences between trends today and Stravinsky than between Beethoven and Wagner. That's perfectly true. Let's, for instance, do 60-year leaps in the history of music, and you'll see it's edifying. The Passion, no, not the Saint, the St. Matthew Passion, the Magic Flute, Lohengrin, and the Rite of Spring. Bach, Mozart, Wagner, Stravinsky. 60-year periods. We are so accustomed to the status quo, it seems amazing. Now, in atonality, let's listen to four short excerpts, very short excerpts, of four atonal pieces by four different composers. Second excerpt, so that was a string quartet.
Troisième extrait.
Third excerpt.
Et dernier extrait.
And last excerpt.
Quelqu'un pourrait-il dire lequel
So could anybody say which excerpt is more modern than the others? Could you give us a chronological classification? No, I don't believe anyone could. All four pieces could have been written by a student of music from one of our top music schools, and if it had been the case, they would have been approved by the professor because they comply with academic style. And they could, all four, have been found in contemporary sections, music sections in music store. These four excerpts date respectively, in the order in which we listened to them, 2010, 1985, 1923, and 1624. I admit that the last excerpt was due to facetiousness on my part, but I wanted to remind you that in the same way as monochrome existed before Malevich, atonality existed long before Schönberg, often experimentally to imitate natural sounds. Here it's Carlo Farina, a composer who was born in roughly 1600. It's a piece called Capriccio Stravagante, and in this passage he imitates the mewing of cats and the barking of dogs. So, it's just to explain that the demands in terms of novelty that are imposed on neotonal composers is just a rhetorical reflex. If we don't take into account the 17th century piece that came at the end, the difference between the two pieces that were Varese for the more recent and Varese the oldest piece and Ferneux the more recent, the differences of 87 years. They're 87 years apart. So, between the impromptus by Schubert and the Rite of Spring, there's the same difference. Well, the stylistic difference is more marked in one case than the other. So why this relative immobility for so many years? Why this lack of progress? It's simply because the similarities between the different movements in atonal music are always presented as different languages. These similarities, in fact, are much more important than the differences, and that all the positive definitions that we sought to have used for this system that list what is to be found in them have never made it possible to describe them, and not as well as the negative list of things that we do not find in them: absence of tonality, absence of regular pulsation, absence of melody, absence of harmony. These are the only shared characteristics of all the atonal systems that are authorized. However, we can go no further in 20th century terms. We can go no further below the absolute, for instance, go lower than absolute zero. So, for instance, if the most romantic composers are to be found at the end of the Romantic period, the most modern modernists are at the beginning of the movement. For instance, Romanticism could be heightened as it progressed, but in the case of the modernists, we could only impoverish the style by repeating the modernistic gesture. You can always add notes to clusters when you use your elbows, for instance. You can always develop new electronic sounds, or a new way of playing the English horn or the bass clarinet. You can always divide quarter tones by 8 or 16. You'll never produce the effect that Webern and his contemporaries produced, the impact they had at the beginning of their time. Whatever novelties we introduce, we shall only reproduce this contemporary style that is not new and which we know by heart. So those who are obsessed with, in their reconstruction of the history of music, as in their production of music, in always moving towards greater modernity, are caught up in a conundrum that would horrify them if they stopped to think. Either they must repeat the modern gesture, which is 100 years old now, or they will regress. So that means they have a choice between doing what they have always done or doing what they have done always. In both cases, they are repeating or going back. They are reactionary, nostalgic revisionists. They are what they have criticized their enemies of being. It so happens that many of them, weary of repeating the modern gesture, are regressing gently. The recantations among composers are increasing as time goes by, and it would be tiring to list them all. However, we may take note of tentative returns of melodies. Harmony and regular pulsations are becoming increasingly frequent, although these remain hesitant, timid even among the official contemporaries, something which would have horrified them only a few years back. If going back appears to be the only solution that even the fiercest opponents seem to be adopting, we may rightly suggest that the only real difference between the neo and the contemporaries is that in a converging approach, the former are more radical than the latter. However, radicality being such a mainstay of modernism means that the anti-modernists are more modern than the modernists. This irresistible aporia sheds light upon the inherent weakness of modernist thought the theoreticians had not foreseen, and which is that it contains the very terms by which it will denounce itself. If being modern is to refuse what is normal, what must I do when the modern has become the norm? If my teacher commands me to be modern, while telling me that being modern means that I should disobey my teacher, what should I do? To conclude, by attempting to answer these apparently insoluble problems, I would like to present two puzzling testimonials which are the two opposite extremities of the modernistic misunderstanding, which come from two people of practically the same generation and who are both inventors of aesthetic modernity which is still practiced in their respective fields today. I am talking about Marcel Duchamp and Arnold Schoenberg. Schoenberg, in 1947, deploring the negative response to one of his pieces by musicians, wrote to a fellow conductor the following. The understanding of my music always suffers from the fact that the musicians do not consider me as a normal composer expressing his themes and melodies in a musical language that is not completely inadequate, but as a modern and dissonant experimental dodecaphonist. There is nothing I would wish for more than to be considered as a sort of improved Tchaikovsky, or that my melodies should be familiar to people and that they should hum them. Duchamp, a few years later, in 1962, wrote to Hans Richter, I threw in their faces the bottle, rack, and the urinal in provocation, and they have come to admire their aesthetic beauty. In other words, the one who would be a respectable successor complains of being considered as revolutionary, and the one who would be a revolutionary complains of being taken for a respectable successor. The one who would like to be an icon complains of being considered as an iconoclast, and the one who would like to remain as iconoclast deplores being considered already as an icon. The fact that these two complaints are perfectly contradictory must not at any cost conceal the unicity of the phenomenon that they are the distant consequence of, because in the end the fact that this art of the 20th century was created in order to create the art of before in the Schoenberg version, or to be brutally depart from it in the Duchamp version, in both cases it did not succeed. 100 years later, people still do not sing Schoenberg in the street, and 100 years later no one is any longer shocked to see an industrial product exhibited in a museum. It has become the norm. Why did these two opposite wages fail? Well, simply because they were based on the same single principle, which was that of abandoning the language of before. God laughs, wrote Bossuet, of those who deplore the effects of which they cherish the causes. In this instance, the effects are different, and both are deplored, but the cause is the same one, and doubly cherished. It is the theoretical desire of discarding one's mother tongue. As time goes by, it will become harder to deny the need to go back on this discarding of the language, because we owe our failures, such as the two failures I have just referred to, We owe this neglect of to the neglect of the language that has resulted, and I hope I have shown this, has resulted in music in a remarkable lack of evolution in the style, and at the same time in a massive and unprecedented loss of interest on the part of instrumentalists and music lovers for the contemporary repertoire. In art, we must not be afraid of appearing to be reactionary if one does not want to appear outmoded. Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote these words, and I propose to try to understand what he meant by that, maybe with the help of Nietzsche, who said, "To enrich the past by generating the future, such is, for me, the meaning of the present." Let us no longer fear the contamination or the ghosts that Pierre Boulez denounced in the past in others by saying that music must not be contaminated or tainted by any stylistic reminiscences, nor should it be haunted by any patronage from the past. Let us invite back this contamination and the ghosts along with the pleasures that accompany them, which have been pushed aside by an art which feels an obsessively hygienic urge to chase away any dust from the past. Shall we ever take full measure of the incredible power of the notion of shedding the past in contemporary artistic apologetics? Let us take a step back so we may better leap forward, and I wager that in a few years what may appear to some as a backwards evolution will finally be recognized for what it is truly, that is, a revolution forwards. Thank you. So I would like to take this opportunity to say that we have no time to ask questions, and also because I agree perfectly with everything that he said, brilliantly, with humor, and I would like to thank him for having given this lecture. There will not be any lectures or seminars until the 10th of January, where I'll talk to you about noise and music, and in the seminar I will welcome Marie-Madeleine Mervan-Roux, who will talk to us about sound in the theatre. Thank you very much. Enjoy your holiday break.